Hello, you're welcome to Prep with Chigozie. Yes, and on this segment today we're going to be discussing the Standard English Convention, and that is a good number of the questions on the Standard English Convention section of the verbal SAT. Yes, I don't discuss this part often because I consider it easier, but I'm just getting to realize that some students also struggle with this sort of question, the question that asks you to choose the option that makes the sentence conform to the conventions of Standard English. Now, this topic area tests a variety of subtopics. We were talking about punctuation, we're talking about your subject-verb agreement, we're talking about modifiers, we're talking about your tenses, as well as your use of the apostrophe, right? So I will give you the tips and tricks as well as the rules that work with these. One thing with dealing with this question is the fact that you have to have the knowledge of all the rules, and once you gain a grasp of all of the rules pertaining to the topics that are tested under the Standard English Convention, you will find that you are able to tackle these questions within less time, so that you can really maximize time on dealing with the more complex reading comprehension sort of topics, right? So yes, we're going to be very quick. I will show you the tips, and I encourage that you take down important notes, as you would need these notes to practice on your own. So yes, the first question I have here, from looking at the options first, I can tell it is testing my knowledge of punctuation. And yes, this is not what you have been taught to do. At least if you're following this episode for a while, this is not what I would typically teach students to do when dealing with the other questions. If you're dealing with the reading comprehension questions, I wouldn't encourage that you look at the options first. I would often advise that you just look at the question so that you know what topic. If it is the main idea, for example, you can tell that from the question. Then you go read the text, and yes, just a quick one, first sentence, last sentence, repeated detail, and be able to summarize the whatever you read yourself, right? That applies to the reading. Have an idea of what the answer should be before encountering the options, but that doesn't necessarily work on the convention question. This is a question that should take you way less time. I'm thinking 30-20 seconds on each of the questions. So you want to look at the options first so that you can tell the particular topic. Now, looking at these options and finding that one gives us a semicolon, another gives us a full stop, and all of that, I can tell this is testing my knowledge of punctuation. So you want to go look at the text to find out where you have a clause, where you have a dependent or an independent clause, where you have a phrase, where you have a sentence, right? As the use of punctuation is largely dependent on the placement of your dependent clauses, independent clauses, and phrases. To have a recap on that, all the rules pertaining to all the punctuation marks tested on the SAT, you want to make recourse to this video showing right here. It will give you a rundown of all of the rules that apply to SAT punctuation topics. So for this one now, I can already tell option A and that this is one tip you should take down, that the semicolon and the full stop perform more or less the same function. They are both used in the middle of two independent clauses. In the case of the full stop, we would call it two sentences. So the full stop will be in the middle of two sentences, right? Whereas the semicolon will be in the middle of two independent clauses. And if you followed the episode on punctuation, you should understand by now that the independent clause and the simple sentence are more or less the same thing, right? So A and B are simply not what I need for this particular question. So my likely options are C and D. Now let me go see which one works. Because glass is very resistant to weathering, forests may last a very long time. That's an independent clause that begins, of course, with a dependent clause. So one single idea. We can have the dash, right, or the comma, but then let's see what is coming after. We then have after a very long time. We then have oldest example estimated to be 250 million years old. That is more or less an appositive information, or something like we like to call on the SAT in non-essential detail, just expanding on the idea of very long time. And notice the other dash we have here, indicative of the fact that we are marking up non-essential information. Hence, the option that gives us the dash is the best answer. So there are tips to pick up from here. It is the fact that the semicolon and the full stop option are more or less synonymous. There's another punctuation sign that is similar to this, the comma followed by the farm boys conjunction. I hope we come across that in another question, but that is one thing you should take note of. And finding that we have a dash somewhere after a complete idea, it goes to mean that there has to be the option that gives us the other dash to mark up the information and non-essential. And there is one last thing you should always try to do on this question type. Plug in the chosen option and find out that it actually works. So I will do that right now. And for non-essentials, I am meant to read it out. I'm meant to read out non-essential information. And if the idea still sounds complete, right, I know that option D is the best answer. Because glass is very resistant to weathering, fulgurites may last a very long time and give scientists a unique window into the past. So you want to also take note of that to be sure that the answer you've chosen is correct, you want to plug it in. And if the answer you chose gives you non-essential detail, you want to read it out. If the sentence sounds correct, reading out non-essential information, you know that answer is the best answer. Let's try another one. Yes, another punctuation question, I can tell from the options as well. And we find, always love to look at the fact, I would love to weigh the likelihood of whether we have similar options. Nothing here seems similar. So let's see. The new graphs were comprehensible and dash and striking. I try to plug in the option at the same time as I read the text. The new graphs were comprehensible and striking. That is a complete idea, right? More or less an independent clause. And after an independent clause, depending on what comes next, by the way, we could have a comma, semicolon, and then we have clearly showing. I'm plugging in option D because I consider that the shortest option. Clearly showing that the major casualties were caused by infectious disease. This should be our best answer. And how do I know this? Because there is a rule that stipulates that you can have an IC, an independent clause, followed by a comma and then a phrase after the comma. So this phrase we have here, clearly showing, that's a phrase, that the majority of casualties were caused by infectious disease. That is relative clause. So we see that isn't a complete idea. Hence, we cannot possibly have the semicolon in the middle, which is what option C is giving us here. That makes it wrong. Option C is giving us the semicolon before a phrase followed by a relative clause. So that cannot work, right? The semicolon is meant to be in the middle of two independent clauses, as I hinted at earlier. A is wrong because A gives you the comma between two independent clauses, and you know that that is wrong. That is called a run-on or a comma splice on the SAT. You want to try it in and see how it makes sense as a comma splice, right? Yes. The new graphs were comprehensible and striking. Complete idea, right? Then after that we have, they clearly showed that the majority of casualties were caused by infectious disease. Another complete idea. They clearly showed. They, subject pronoun, making the next part of the sentence another independent clause. So the comma is the wrongest option to have there. Maybe if we had a semicolon before they clearly showed, that would have been even a perfect answer. But it turns now we have a phrase after the independent clause, so the right answer should be option D. I think I want to believe that there are tips you've taken down now. An IC can be followed by a comma and then a phrase. And you know also that when you have a comma between two complete ideas, that is called a comma splice, hence it is wrong. You know you can have a semicolon between two independent clauses, right? And of course, not to the comma. Yes, we'll run through this one quickly. The question we have here is testing our knowledge of modifier placement. And how do I know that? Looking at the options, yes, I find that the options are made up of the same word choices but in different arrangement, in different placement. You can take a look. Modern technology is being utilized by archaeologists and restoration officials. Utilization of modern technology is allowing archaeologists and restoration. So you find the keywords in all of the options but in different positioning. So you know you're tested for a modifier. And the simple rule for dealing with this is identify the modifying phrase, which often comes before the blank. A modifier typically leaves you asking who or what. So once you read the modifying phrase, instinctively you're thinking, who is this referring to? Or what is this referring to? Yes, so it means that after that comma, after the comma phrase, I should have the subject. I should have the subject that answers the question of the who or the what of the modifying phrase. Let's see how that works here. Recognizing these problems, I'm asking who is recognizing. It takes a human being, a researcher, to recognize, right? So recognizing this problem, I need the option that simply gives me the name of a professional or an expert or a researcher or a person's name. A certainly cannot work because A begins with modern technology. Modern technology cannot possibly recognize. B gives us utilization. C gives us archaeologists and restoration officials. So you see how perfect that sounds, right? It's giving us names of professionals, and you see how that matches with the modifying phrase. Recognizing these problems, archaeologists and restoration officials are utilizing modern technology to strengthen Pompeii's buildings and restore the city's frescoes. So we have one more question on this file to go, and yes, looking at this, I can already tell what the topic is. It is testing my knowledge of the semicolon for marking off items in a list. How do I know that? The comma followed, semicolon followed by a conjunction. This is a major job. Whenever you find that the semicolon is escorted by the conjunction in the text, the question is simply testing your knowledge of using the semicolon to mark up items in a list. Now, when the semicolon marks up items in a list, it does that so in a peculiar way different from what is obtainable of the comma. So the comma would give you the same words in the same word class. Let me give you an example of how the comma marks up items in a list. I would have something like, I love to eat rice, plantain, and egg. Rice, comma, plantain, comma, and egg. Notice the comma before the and. It is now compulsory on the SAT, regarded as the Oxford comma. So notice that each word class constituting the list are nouns. Is a noun, rather. Rice is a noun, plantain is a noun, egg is another noun. But if the semicolon were doing the marking of, it would be slightly different. The list would be a little more complex. Take this example. I love to eat rice, comma, a carb-rich meal, semicolon, plantain, another meal rich in carbohydrate, semicolon, and eggs, which has a huge protein content. So you see how that works. After each item of the list, I have a phrase explaining it or a clause explaining it. Hence, the semicolon will be used to introduce the next item of the list. Right? If you use the comma in such situation to be too clumsy and confusing. So, and see, notice that I use the semicolon and the conjunction before mentioning eggs, right? That is exactly what we have here. So I don't have to read the first sentence before the sentence closer to the blank. I don't need that detail. Remember, maximize your time dealing with this question so you can really deal with the reading comprehension carefully. He has done this through his first interactive space themed application, Astro. Astro is the name of the first item, interactive space themed application, comma, Astro. They're giving us this as well, comma, then the date. Yes, in 2016, semicolon, a digital platform, I plug in the option at the same time, a digital platform, comma, named Cosmos Network. So the right answer obviously is option C. See, easy peasy. So I hope this helps, and I hope you took important notes while watching this, right, so that you can practice on your own. All of the room. Until I come your way next time with more tips like this, good luck with practice.